Hello! In this video, we're going to focus on how to rig a character in Moho Debut. I'm going to focus on how to use basic rigging tools as well as other rigging techniques. So, as you can see, we're picking up right where we left off in the other video. We have our character fully vectorized, and the character has also been divided up into layers, which is going to make rigging super easy. Since we don't need our reference sketch anymore, I'm going to go ahead and delete it from the layers panel. To start rigging, you always need to add a bone layer to your project. So we're going to click the Add Layer button in the Layers panel, but this time we're going to select Bone. Now, as you can see, we have a new layer added to the project, and if we look at kind, we can tell that it's a bone layer. And the layer also has a little bone icon, which also lets us know that this is a bone layer. And I'm going to call this new layer Flower. Now, the next step we need to do is we need to move all the layers that make up our character and add them to this bone layer. The bone layer kind of acts like a folder. It holds all the layers that make up the character. And we can only rig layers that are within this bone layer. So we can do this two ways. We can either grab each layer and individually drag it to the bone layer, or we can select all the layers and drag them in at once, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to select the face layer, the petals, the stem, and the leaves, and I'm going to hold down the control button so I can select multiple layers. Now I'm going to click and drag these layers to my bone layer. And when I release my mouse, you can see that these layers have now been added to the bone layer. And you can also see that the bone layer now has this collapse icon, which is indicating that these layers are within the bone layer. And if I click the collapse button, it hides all the layers for this bone layer. But we need to see the layers while rigging, so I'm going to leave this bone layer uncollapsed. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add our bones so we can rig our character. And you can only add bones when you're on a bone layer. So when I select my bone layer, we now have access to the bone tools. And if you notice, the drawing tools have disappeared because drawing tools are only available for vectored layers, while bone layers are just for rigging, so we don't need the drawing tools. So we're going to start creating our rig with the Add Bones tool. When creating a rig, you should always first create a root bone. A root bone controls the entire rig and allows you to easily move it around in your canvas. Think of the root bone as the backbone of your rig. And I'm going to change the color of this bone to red so we know that it's our root bone. Bone colors are really only used for identification. They don't really affect how the bone works, so it's just for aesthetics. Now that we have our root bone, we're now going to create the rest of our bones. So I'm going to create a chain of 3 bones for the stem. So 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to create 2 more bones for our leaves. Now, if we use the Manipulate Bones tool, which is the tool that allows us to move the bones, we can see that our rig is moving, but it's warping. It's not really moving how we planned it to move. This is because the rig is currently using bone strength to control the drawing. When you create a bone, it automatically has a bone strength value of 1. Each bone has a strength value that controls how large its region is influenced. So the higher the bone strength, the more it's going to influence the image, and which is automatically on, by the way. So if I select the bone strength tool, you'll actually be able to see the bone strength for all the bones we currently have created. But the problem with bone strength is that it's very difficult to control if I move my character. And we can see this through this strange warping that's happening to our character right now. We don't really have the precise control of how our character moves. So we're actually going to use a different way to control our character. So using the bone strength tool, we're going to remove the bone strength for all of our bones. So we're going to select the bone, and we're going to drag to the left to remove the bone strength. If you drag to the right, you'll increase it. And when we set the bone strength to 0, then the bone doesn't have any influence over the drawing anymore. This is going to let us use a different rigging technique, which is going to allow us to have more control of our character when animating. So we're going to use 2 methods to rig our character. The first is the point binding method, and the second will be the layer binding method. So let's first start with the point binding method. For points binding, we're actually going to use the vector points from our shape, and we're going to bind these points to the bone itself. This method is best to use if you have a shape that needs to be influenced by multiple bones. So, for example, our stem needs to be influenced by these 3 bones. To do this, we need to first select the layer we want to bind, which is our stem layer. And if you notice, there's now new tools available on our vector layer. This is because we moved the layer into a bone layer. Next, we're going to select the bone we want our points to be binded to. So I'm going to select this first bone. And then I'm going to select the Bind Points tool and select the points I want to be binded to this bone. Once I have them selected, I am then going to select the Bind Points button to, bind the points. And now when I click the Manipulate Bones tool, you can see that the points I selected are now being controlled by this one bone. But the points that were not binded are not moving. This is because I need to bind these points to the 2 other bones if I want them to move. So again, I'm going to select the next bone, which is this middle bone, and I'm going to select the Bind Points tool and select the next points I want to bind, and again, I'm going to select Bind Points. And we're going to do this a 3rd time for our 3rd bone. Select the bone using the Select Bones tool, and then select the Bind Points tool. Then select the last points and select the Bind Points button. Now all the points on this shape have been bounded to a bone. And when we use the Manipulate Bones tool, you can see that the entire shape is now being manipulated by 3 separate bones. So this layer has now been fully rigged. Next, we're going to use the Bind Layer method to bind the face layer to this top bone, this one right here. And layer binding is best used when a layer needs to be manipulated by one single bone. And so to do this, we're first going to select the layer we want to bind, which is the face layer, and we're going to then select the Bind Layers tool and select the bone we want to connect this layer to. See how the bone is now highlighted? This is Moho letting us know that this entire layer has been binded to this one bone. And now when we use the Manipulate Bones tool, we can see that our face layer is now being controlled by the top bone. So this layer is now done. Next, we're going to bind the leaf layer using the points binding method. Remember, layer binding only involves one bone per layer, while points binding can be used for multiple bones for a single layer. And for this layer in particular, we need to bind 2 bones to one layer. So in this case, it's best to use the points binding method. So again, use the Select Bones tool to select the bone, and then use the Bind Points tool to select the points you want to combine. So it will be this entire leaf right here. And then select the Bind Points button, and we're going to do the exact same thing for the second leaf. And now our leaves are being controlled by 2 separate bones. But when we use the Manipulate Bones tool, our second leaf isn't being controlled by the stem, which is making it move in this weird way. We need to now reparent this bone so it's being influenced by the stem bone. So right now, our leaf bones are being influenced by each other. They're not being influenced by the stem. So we need to reparent both leaf bones so they can move correctly. To do this, we're going to first select the bone we want to reparent using the Select Bones tool. And then we're going to use the Reparent Bones tool to change how the bones are parented. This arrow represents where the bone is being parented. So to fix this, we just need to select the middle bone to reparent the leaf layer. And we're going to do this again with the second layer. So select the bone using the Select Bones tool, and then go back to the Reparent tool, and then select the middle bone. I also want to move the location of this bone because it's too far away from the stem. To do this, we're going to use the Transform Bones tool, and we're going to use the handle at the end of this bone to move it closer. And I'm going to use the handle on the other end to resize the bone. And now I'm going to use the Manipulate Bones tool to see how the rig is looking. Yep, the stem is working and the face is attached to the top bone, and the leaves are now moving with the stem. Now, the last thing we need to do is we need to add some new bones so we can bind the petals to this rig. This means that each petal is going to need its own bone. So I'm going to use the Add Bones tool to create 5 new bones for each of my petals. Next, I need to remove all the bone strength from these bones, and I also need to reparent them as well. But I don't want to do this individually because that would be very time consuming. So instead, I'm going to select all the bones I just created, and I'm going to edit them at the same time. So I'm going to use the Select Bones tool to select all 5 of my bones, and I'm going to hold down Shift so I can select all 5. Now I'm going to go to the Bone Strength tool and remove all the strength from all 5 of these bones. And lastly, I'm going to select the Reparent Bone tool to parent them to this top bone. Now I need to use the Bind Points method to combine each petal to their respective bone. So the first thing we need to do is we need to select the layer, which is the petals layer. Then we're going to select the bone using the Select Bones tool. And then we're going to select the Bind Points tool and select the petal we want to bind. And we're going to do this again for all 5 petals. So again, select the Bones tool, select the bones, use the Bind Points tool and select the points and bind them. And I'm going to do this again 3 more times. So now that I've rigged all 5 petals, I want to use the Manipulate Bones tool just to make sure that they're all rigged. So yeah, each petal can move individually and they're all rigged to their bones. And for these petals, I'm actually going to add Bone Dynamics, which is going to automatically move the bones for me. So using the Select Bones tool, I'm going to select all 5 bones again. And then I'm going to open the Bone Constraints menu, and at the bottom, I'm going to enable Bone Dynamics. And I'm also going to go ahead and enable Bone Dynamics for the leaf bones as well. So I'm going to select the leaf bones, and I'm going to turn on Bone Dynamics. And you can only see Bone Dynamics when you're animating, so I'm going to quickly create a test animation so we can test out the rig. So I'm going to move my playhead to frame 24, and I'm going to use the Manipulate Bones tool to move my rig. And as you can see, a keyframe was added. Then I'm going to move my playhead to frame 48 and move it again, and as you can see, another keyframe was added. And now I'm going to play my animation to test it out. So yeah, now the petals and the leaves have a little wiggle to them, which I didn't have to animate at all. That was all Bone Dynamics. And looking at this animation, my rig is working. So now my character is fully rigged and we're now ready to start animating. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to use the rig we just created to animate, and I'm also going to show you how to export your animation. So that's all I have for you for this video. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope to see you in the next video.